It's November 17th, 1965. Deep in the sweltering jungles of South Vietnam's Central Highlands, a long line of American soldiers is on the move, heading for a clearing called Landing Zone Albany. These are the men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. They're exhausted, filthy, and short on everything but courage. For the last 3 days, they've been supporting their brothers in the 1st Battalion, who were trapped in some of the most vicious fighting of the war at a spot known as LZ X-ray. Now it's their turn to push on, but this isn't just a routine march. With every step through the razor-sharp elephant grass, they are walking deeper and deeper into a perfectly laid trap, hidden in the trees and dug into the dirt. An entire North Vietnamese army regiment, fresh and ready for a fight, is waiting for them. They're about to spring an ambush so sudden, so violent, and so completely devastating that it will kick off 6 hours of pure chaos and carnage. What happened next would become one of the single deadliest days for a U.S. battalion in the entire Vietnam War. This is the forgotten story of the Ia Drang Valley, the ambush at LZ Albany, a desperate, brutal fight for survival against impossible odds. Section 1. The Road to Ia Drang. To really get what happened at LZ Albany, you have to understand where things stood in 1965. The conflict in Vietnam, which had been a distant proxy struggle, was quickly turning into a full-blown American war. The old strategy of just advising the South Vietnamese army wasn't working against the communist insurgency, which was backed by the highly skilled North Vietnamese Army, or NVA. Fearing that South Vietnam would collapse, President Lyndon B. Johnson made a game-changing decision. He sent American ground troops into direct combat. Leading this new strategy was a revolutionary new unit, the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile. This was an army that belonged to the sky. Instead of slow trucks and tanks, they had fleets of helicopters. Their whole playbook was built on speed and surprise. Huey helicopters could jump over impassable jungle, drop thousands of troops deep behind enemy lines, hit the enemy where they were weakest, and get out before they could even react. At least that was the theory. In November 1965, the 1st Cav was ordered into the Central Highlands, a rugged, mountainous region right next to Cambodia. U.S. intelligence believed the NVA was using the area, especially the Ia Drang Valley, as a massive highway to funnel troops and supplies for a major offensive meant to slice South Vietnam in half. The 1st Cavalry's mission, called Operation Silver Bayonet, was simple: find the enemy and kill them. It was set to be the first major showdown between the new airmobile concept and the NVA's battle-hardened soldiers. The Ia Drang Valley was dominated by the Chupong Massif, a huge mountain range that the NVA used as a sanctuary. It was here, on November 14th, that the first act of the battle unfolded. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and his 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were dropped into a small clearing at the foot of the mountain called Landing Zone X-ray. They were immediately surrounded and attacked by a much larger NVA force. For 3 days and 2 nights, the men at LZ X-ray fought for their lives. Surrounded and under constant assault, they held their ground against wave after wave of attacks. The battle was a whirlwind of close-quarters combat and incredible acts of bravery. What saved them was American firepower. Non-stop artillery, relentless airstrikes, and the awesome power of B-52 bombers created a protective wall of explosions around their small perimeter, inflicting devastating casualties on the NVA. The image of outnumbered American soldiers holding off a massive enemy force became legendary, immortalized in books and movies. It was hailed as a tactical victory for the U.S. and proof that the airmobile concept worked. But the battle for Ia Drang was far from over. It was just the opening act for a much more brutal and arguably more horrific fight. Section 2. The Ghosts of X-Ray. By the morning of November 17th, the main NVA force had pulled back from LZ X-Ray, leaving hundreds of their dead behind. Hal Moore's 1st Battalion was battered, exhausted, and emotionally drained. They were evacuated, their faces showing the 1,000-yard stares of men who had just walked through hell. Taking their place on that blood-soaked ground were other units of the 7th Cavalry, including the 2nd Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade. McDade was a West Point grad, but he was more of a staff officer without much recent command experience in the field. His battalion, part of the famed 1st Cavalry Division, was a mixed group. Some companies had seen heavy fighting while reinforcing X-Ray, while others were relatively fresh. But all of them were stepping into a landscape of death. The air was thick with the stench of burnt explosives and decay. The ground was littered with shell casings, discarded gear, and the bodies of NVA soldiers. The American High Command, led by General William Westmoreland, was eager to press what they saw as an advantage. They didn't want it to look like a retreat after the victory at X-Ray. So the order came down. Instead of being flown out, McDade's battalion was to march overland a few miles to a new clearing designated LZ Albany. It sounded simple enough, a short tactical march. But the decision was based on a massive intelligence failure. The Americans thought the NVA was broken and running. They were dead wrong. While the NVA units that hit X-Ray were badly hurt, other fresh battalions were still prowling the area. This included the lethal 8th Battalion of the 66th NVA Regiment and parts of the 33rd Regiment, well-rested, disciplined soldiers who were looking for a fight. The men of the 207th were in no shape for a long trek through enemy territory. They were worn out, physically and mentally. They were low on water and ammo, having given much of it to the 1st Battalion. One veteran, George Wasenko Jr., later remembered the bone-deep exhaustion and the feeling of heading into the unknown as they left the relative safety of X-Ray. They were a battalion of about 400 soldiers, many already haunted by the carnage they had just witnessed. They were about to walk out of the frying pan and straight into the fire. Section 3. The Long Walk and the Trap. The march to LZ Albany started around 9 a.m. on November 17th. The terrain was an absolute nightmare. The soldiers forced their way through dense jungle and thickets of elephant grass so tall it could swallow a man, with edges sharp enough to slice through uniforms and skin. The heat was suffocating, and the humid air was so thick it made every breath feel like a struggle. The battalion stretched out in a long, vulnerable column. The reconnaissance platoon was up front, followed by Alpha Company, the headquarters unit, Charlie Company, and finally, Delta Company at the rear. The entire formation was over 500 yards long, a quarter-mile of men lost in the jungle. In this formation, they were a perfect target. Command was difficult. Companies couldn't easily support each other, and their flanks were wide open. As they pushed forward, they started seeing signs of the enemy. A small NVA patrol was spotted. Then they captured 2 enemy soldiers. During interrogation, the prisoners claimed they were just deserters, tired of the war. In reality, they were scouts from an NVA battalion, and their comrades had already slipped away to report the exact location and direction of the American column. The trap was about to be sprung. The NVA commanders, realizing the golden opportunity they'd been handed, moved with deadly speed. They weren't broken and retreating. They were reorganizing for another attack. The 8th Battalion of the 66th Regiment, along with another battalion from the 33rd Regiment, a combined force of over 500 soldiers, began to shadow the American column. They moved like ghosts through the jungle, paralleling the Americans and setting up their kill zone. Their plan was a classic ambush. Let the head of the column walk past, then hit the exposed flank with everything they had, shattering the formation and causing maximum chaos. Around 1:15 in the afternoon, the front of the American column reached the edge of the clearing known as LZ Albany. It wasn't much of a landing zone, just a big open area with termite mounds scattered about, surrounded by thick woods. And it was here that a series of fatal mistakes came together. Lieutenant Colonel McDade, the battalion commander, was at the front. Believing the area was clear, he called a halt. He wanted his company commanders to come forward to scout the LZ and plan defensive positions before the rest of the battalion moved in. The commanders from the middle and rear of the column were called to the front, leaving their men leaderless hundreds of yards behind them. The long line of exhausted soldiers stopped right where they were. Men dropped their packs and leaned against their rifles, taking the first chance they'd had in hours to rest. Section 4. The kill zone. The quiet was shattered by a single rifle shot, immediately followed by the piercing shriek of a bugle. In an instant, the jungle exploded. From the north and east, a hurricane of fire tore through the American column. Mortar rounds rained down, exploding among the resting soldiers. Heavy machine guns opened up from hidden bunkers, their tracers ripping through the tall grass and cutting men to pieces. Hundreds of NVA soldiers rose from their hiding spots, screaming as they charged into the stunned and disorganized Americans. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The ambush caught the 2/7th in the worst possible way. Halted, spread out, and with their leaders separated from their men. Command and control simply vanished. The radios were jammed with frantic, overlapping cries. "We're being overrun! They're everywhere!" One survivor, Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, remembered that most of the casualties happened in the first 30 minutes. Men who had been relaxing just moments before were mowed down before they could even raise their rifles. The NVA attackers were so close that American artillery and air support were useless at first. Calling for fire meant calling it down on their own heads. The battle instantly devolved from a military engagement into hundreds of small, desperate individual fights for survival. PFC Jack Smith, a rifleman, recalled the pure terror of hearing Vietnamese voices just feet away and seeing enemy soldiers materialize out of thin air. The fighting was savage, hand to hand, a brutal struggle with rifles used as clubs, with bayonets, knives, and even shovels. Soldiers found themselves in life or death wrestling matches in the elephant grass, choking and clawing to stay alive. The center of the American column, where headquarters and Charlie companies were, completely collapsed. These companies were caught leaderless in the open. The NVA swarmed them, and some survivors later told horrifying stories of the enemy executing wounded soldiers as they lay on the ground. The American formation was shattered into small, isolated pockets of resistance, with men grouping together behind a termite mound or a thicket of trees, fighting back to back against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere. Sergeant John Eade of the 2nd Platoon found himself fighting against overwhelming odds as his entire platoon was wiped out around him. He was shot multiple times, even in the head, but kept fighting, killing several attackers before he was critically wounded. His story was typical of the chaos. This wasn't a battle of platoons and companies, but of small groups of terrified but determined men who simply refused to die. Amidst the horror, there were incredible acts of bravery. Captain George Forrest, commanding Alpha Company at the rear, heard the fire erupt far ahead. Without waiting for orders, he sprinted the entire length of the ambush, dodging bullets and explosions to get back to his men and set up a defense. His leadership helped the rear of the column form a small, stable perimeter, an island of calm in a sea of chaos. At the front of the column, the recon platoon and other elements also managed to form a defensive circle around the landing zone itself. They were cut off from the rest of the battalion, which was being systematically destroyed behind them. For what felt like an eternity, the battle raged. The air was thick with smoke, gunpowder, and the screams of the wounded and dying from both sides. After the initial shock, the surviving American officers started to regain some control. Crawling under a hail of bullets, fire support officers got on their radios and called in artillery, screaming for danger-close fire missions right on top of their own positions. Shells from 105mm howitzers miles away began to crash down on the battlefield, exploding among NVA and Americans alike. Then came the air support. Sky Raiders roared in at treetop level, dropping napalm and cluster bombs. The napalm canisters tumbled into the jungle and erupted into giant fireballs, incinerating everything. The effect was terrifying and devastating, but in the close quarters chaos, some napalm strikes fell short, burning American soldiers alongside the NVA. John Eade recalled the searing heat as napalm exploded near him, adding severe burns to his bullet wounds. The fight for survival lasted for 6 brutal hours. As the sun began to set, medevac pilots from the 229th Huey Slicks attempted suicide missions, flying their unarmed helicopters into the heart of the firefight to pull out the wounded. As darkness fell, the main NVA assault began to fade. Having inflicted horrific casualties, they started to melt back into the jungle. For the American survivors huddled in their small perimeters, the fight wasn't over. The night was filled with sporadic gunfire, the chilling sound of NVA soldiers moving through the grass, and the moans of the wounded. The longest night of their lives had just begun. Section 5. The longest night and the dawn. As total darkness fell on LZ Albany, the organized NVA attack shifted to a more sinister kind of terror. The main force had pulled back, but enemy soldiers remained, moving like ghosts through the tall grass. For the American survivors, many wounded and lying among their dead friends, the night was an ordeal of unimaginable horror. They played dead, holding their breath as enemy patrols passed inches away. Survivors like James Lawrence later recalled hearing Vietnamese voices all around him as he lay wounded, convinced that any second he would be discovered and killed. Throughout the night, sporadic firefights broke out. Reinforcements were finally on their way. Another company arrived on foot in the darkness, fighting their way to the main perimeter to help hold the line. Later, Bravo Company of the 207th, veterans of the fighting at X-Ray, were flown in, their helicopters landing in the pitch black, guided only by faint lights from the ground. When dawn broke on November 18th, it revealed a scene of absolute devastation. One platoon commander described it as looking like a long, bloody traffic jam in the jungle. The battlefield was a silent, tangled mess of death. The elephant grass was matted down and stained dark with blood. American and North Vietnamese bodies lay where they had fallen, sometimes locked together in a final embrace. Burned patches of ground marked the napalm strikes. The air, once filled with the roar of battle, was now heavy with a dreadful silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded. The first task was grim beyond words. securing the area and recovering the dead and wounded. Soldiers moved slowly through the grass, checking every body, a heartbreaking process of accounting for their lost friends. The casualty figures were staggering. Out of the approximately 400 men of the 2 to 7th caught in the ambush, 151 were killed and another 1 to 21 were wounded. This was a casualty rate of nearly 70%. While January 31st, 1968, the first day of the Tet Offensive, saw more American deaths across the entire country, 246, the concentrated slaughter at LZ Albany made it one of the bloodiest single-day battles for a specific American unit in the entire war. The North Vietnamese also paid a heavy price. U.S. forces counted 403 NVA bodies on the battlefield at Albany, with estimates of another 150 wounded. It was a testament to the ferocious resistance of the American soldiers who, even when surprised and shattered, had fought back with everything they had. The fight at LZ Albany was over, but the questions were just beginning. Section 6. The Bitter Ledger. In the aftermath, both sides did what armies always do. They claimed victory. North Vietnam celebrated a textbook ambush, proving they could go toe-to-toe with America's elite soldiers. They had neutralized America's greatest advantages, air power and artillery, by getting inside the wire, fighting so close that the Americans couldn't use their heavy weapons without hitting their own men. The American command, meanwhile, focused on the grim math of the body count. They pointed to the over 400 NVA dead left on the field, a number far greater than American losses. General Westmoreland argued that the entire Ia Drang campaign, including both X-Ray and Albany, was a major success that proved the airmobile strategy worked. But for the survivors of Albany, those numbers felt empty. They had walked into a slaughterhouse. The battle revealed critical flaws in American tactics, the danger of marching in long columns, the perils of overconfidence, and the complete collapse of command and control under fire. In the American press, the story of LZ Albany was almost completely buried by the heroic tale